Wolf's paper, Moral Saints, begins with these two very controversial sentences. She says, "I don't know whether there are any moral saints, but if there are, I'm glad that neither I nor those about whom I care the most are among them." So she's not sure if anyone has ever reached the level of being a Confucian sage, extending out their benevolence to all. She's not sure whether anyone has ever managed to achieve perfection with regard to the Aristotelian virtues. But she says, either way, whether these people actually exist or not, boy, I'm sure glad I'm not one of them. And I'm sure glad that people I care about aren't either. That would suck to be one of these people. Okay, so we're going to formulate her line of reasoning as an argument a little more explicitly than she does. But first, let's just understand a little bit about some of the terms she uses. So what does she mean, first of all, by moral saints, the title of the paper? So she says, a moral saint is a person who, quote, is as morally worthy as can be. Okay, so sort of morally perfect person. Well, what does that mean? I mean, can we get more detail here? Well, first, she seems to gloss that or give an equivalent definition of as morally worthy as can be right at the outset as every action is as morally good as possible. So she seems to think of moral perfection as something about consistently perfect actions. She later on goes on to elaborate on what this means. A necessary condition of moral sainthood, she says, would be that one's life be dominated by a commitment to improving the welfare of others or of society as a whole. Notice the sense in which there's a kind of maximizing quality to Wolf's conception of moral sainthood here. The moral saint is one whose life is dominated by commitment to improving welfare. Not just, on Sundays they volunteer. Their whole life is completely dominated by concern for other people. Are there real life moral saints? Well, she says she's not sure. She mentions a few candidates. I think she mentions all of these, if not at least a few of them. But here are 4 possible candidates. These people all had their flaws, of course. Some of them more so than others. I mean, there's been, I think, in India, a bit of a reckoning with Gandhi's legacy. That there were aspects of his personal life that were revealed later that were less than perfect. I think, of course, MLK had his flaws too. But as far as this life, as far as practical reality, these are people who did incredible things for their societies. In the case of Nelson Mandela, for South Africa and the ending of apartheid, for Gandhi, he played a central role in liberating India from British rule. For MLK, of course, the civil rights movement here in the United States. And Mother Teresa of Calcutta did incredible work her entire life with the Sisters of the Poor, I believe is her organization, in Calcutta, India, where she lived with those suffering from incredible poverty and held the hands of people who were dying terrible deaths of disease, of hunger, and did whatever she could to restore some of these people's humanity, and if it was too late for them, to just comfort them. So all 4 of these people really made a mark and improved people's lives more than any of us could, possibly dream of doing, I think. So maybe they're moral saints. We'll sort of keep them in the background of our minds as we're going through and hold up some of the claims that Woolf makes against the best candidates that we have for real moral saints and see how they fare. One important thing she says toward the beginning of the piece is that she makes this distinction, right? So this is what a moral saint is, somebody whose actions are as morally good as can be. But that doesn't tell us anything about what motivates the moral saint to do what they do. And she said we can kind of divide between two ways that a given moral saint might be, two different ways that a moral saint might be motivated to act in these morally perfect ways. What prompts their behavior? On the one hand, there's the loving saint, for whom she describes this person this way. The happiness of the moral saint, for the loving saint, would truly lie in the happiness of others. And by happiness here, she means like something closer to hedonic happiness, like the feeling of joy and fulfillment. And so he would devote himself to others gladly and with a whole and open heart. The loving saint loves to be a moral saint. They love to do good things for other people. That is what gets them up in the morning. And of course, it's not always going to be easy, but even in the hard moments, they are at peace about what they're doing and feel as if they are carrying out exactly what they're sort of meant to do, if they believe in destiny, or if they believe in a divine plan, or just what they deeply care about. And this fills them with a sense of joy and fulfillment. The rational saint, on the other hand, the external actions are the same, so they're both doing the Mother Teresa, Gandhi, MLK type stuff, but whereas the loving saint is deriving a lot of joy and happiness from this activity, the rational saint is, it's very difficult for the rational saint to do all of this. What makes the rational saint a moral saint, says Woolf, is rather that he pays little or no attention to his own happiness, in light of the overriding importance he gives to wider concerns of morality. In other words, this person sacrifices his own interests to the interests of others and feels the sacrifice as such. So the rational saint is going around doing all of the same great things, but from the inside, for the rational saint, this feels like the sacrifice that it is. The rational saint might much prefer to be with their spouse. Or maybe they don't have a spouse. Maybe they are like Mother Teresa and part of a monastic community. But they would much rather be in love with somebody and have a family. But they feel this overwhelming call to moral duty. And so they decide, I'm not going to do that. As much as it would make me happy, I'm going to give to others. As terrible as I know that will be for me, it's worth it because that's what my moral duty is. They might have the same kinds of interests and passions that you and I do, but unlike us, they actually do what we tend to recognize is the morally best thing to do, which is to give your life to promote the well-being of others. And it feels to them as painful as it would to you and I to do that. So just a quick potential example of each. Again, like this departs from the ideal that Woolf gives in the piece, but on some readings or on some understandings, Nelson Mandela may have been something like a loving saint. Again, he wasn't like, perfectly happy all the time, but in general, he was very optimistic, and he did make remarks that suggested that for him, his lifelong devotion to justice and to restoring the dignity of Black South Africans was fulfilling and gave him joy. So this is just a quick passage from his autobiography. He says this, I've walked that long road to freedom, but I've discovered the secret that after climbing a great hill, one only finds that there are many more hills to climb. So, I mean, that sounds challenging if you've ever been on a hike or gone on a long run through the hills, which I used to do in Charlottesville. That was a lot of fun. You do come to a point where you're like, oh boy, another hill. I just got to the top of this one. But instead of despairing, here's what he says: I have taken a moment here to rest, to steal a view of the glorious vista that surrounds me, and to look back on the distance I've come. So this spirit that he has of recognizing the challenge that lays before him and those who are doing his work, and the extraordinary sacrifices he's already made, he sees it as glorious, like a glorious vista, and he sort of beholds it and rejoices in it. Now, by contrast, it wasn't known at the time, but Mother Teresa, most of her life struggled with deep depression. And this was, I think, to a lot of Catholics a shock when some of her personal letters were published, and it became very clear that she had a lot of doubt, including about the existence of God, but especially about why it is that she didn't feel God's presence through all of the work she was doing, which she felt was what God was calling her to do. There's this sense of like, I'm throwing myself into this work, but I also don't feel as if God is like rewarding me with any experience of God's presence for doing what I'm doing. And indeed, perhaps punishing me with a feeling of despair. Because remember, Mother Teresa is surrounded by incredible, untold human misery, day after day after day. And of course, like most of us, that gets to her. And it did get to her, and she kept it to herself, but she was deeply depressed. She says this, this is in one of her personal, I think like a diary. In the darkness, Lord my God, who am I that you should forsake me? The child of your love, and now become as the most hated one. The one you have thrown away as unwanted, unloved. I call, I cling, I want, and there is no answer. Where I try to raise my thoughts to heaven, there is such convicting emptiness that those very thoughts turn like sharp knives and hurt my very soul. Love, the word, it brings nothing. I am told God lives in me, and yet the reality of darkness and coldness and emptiness is so great that nothing touches my soul. And yet, despite that inner despair, despite that sounds miserable, like psychologically, despite that, Mother Teresa continued, and for the rest of her life continued doing this work. So maybe rational saint isn't a perfect word, but this contrast, I think, is present in Mandela versus Teresa here. Mother Teresa experienced her sacrifice as the sacrifice that it was, and felt it unrewarded with any deep joy, and only just deep depression. Mandela, on the other hand, I'm sure he had his moments, but he experienced his work as joyful and as energizing.